Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're going to go through an overview of the male reproductive system. The purpose of the male reproductive system is to produce and supply sperm. When we look at the external anatomy, you see two things. You see that of the penis and the scrotum. Inside of the scrotum is the testes, and this is where we should begin our discussion because the testes is the site of sperm production. So, let's begin. We'll look at the scrotum itself. Now, the scrotum is a sac that houses the testes. Now, testes, plural, T-E-S-T-E-S, the testes is the site of sperm production. Now, if we were to have a look at the testes and have a look inside, you will find that it's made up of these individual lobes. And within each lobe, you're going to find something called seminiferous tubules. So these are just convoluted tubes inside each of these lobules of the testes. And if you to have a look within these tubes, there's two major cell types that you should be aware of. First cell type are the Leydig cells. The second cell type are the Sertoli cells. Now, what do these cells do within the testes, specifically at the seminiferous tubules? The Leydig cells produce testosterone. And the Sertoli cells produce something called androgen binding protein. Androgen binding protein, also known as ABP. Now, an androgen is a male sex hormone, i.e. testosterone. So it binds to testosterone. If they bind together, what they do is they promote the production of sperm. Sperm production. Now this is important because you're going to have signals coming from the brain, specifically from these glands that sit underneath the hypothalamus in the brain, called the pituitary glands. And the pituitary gland has two lobes, an anterior and posterior. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland releases a hormone, anterior pituitary, releases something called gonadotropins. There's two types of gonadotropins. There is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Now, once a male hits puberty, these hormones begin to be released. Luteinizing hormone, I've drawn in red as you can see, luteinizing hormone stimulates the Leydig cells. Think of the L and the L. The follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the Sertoli cells. They produce testosterone and androgen binding protein respectively, and sperm production begins in the seminiferous tubules of the testes. Sperm is starting to be produced. This is happening at puberty. Now, the sperm that's produced is transported into this structure here that lines the outside of the testes called the epididymis. The epididymis. And the role of the epididymis is to store sperm, mature sperm, and then transport sperm into this next tube, which is called the vas deferens, also known as the ductus deferens. Vas deferens, also known as the ductus deferens. So if you've ever heard of a vasectomy, so if a male no longer wants to produce children, they can have a vasectomy. Ectomy as a suffix means to cut, so they cut the vas deferens. So a vas deferens, or ductus deferens that is intact, will transport sperm via the ductus deferens. You can see it loops around. You can see it loops around the bladder here. That's the bladder, which is part of the urinary system, not the reproductive system. And then it joins together with a gland here. Now this gland is called This gland is called the seminal vesicle. And the seminal vesicle or seminal vesicles, what that does is it produces a really important fluid. It actually produces two-thirds of the volume of semen. And one of its major components is that of fructose, which is an energy source. So, fructose, very similar to glucose, is what sperm uses as its energy source. Eat your fruit, gentlemen. So, seminal vesicles produce this fluid, the seminal fluid. It mixes with the sperm that's coming from the testes via the ductus deferens, and it enters the ejaculatory duct. The ejaculatory duct right here. Now you can see the ejaculatory duct will merge together with part of the urethra, which is coming from the bladder, and it forms the prostatic urethra. Now, this structure here is the prostate. Not prostrate, which means to lay down, but prostate. The prostate, you can see, houses both the ejaculatory duct, which is coming from the seminal vesicles and from the vas deferens, but also the urethra. And the urethra is going to be sharing a pipe that houses urine, but also this semen, which has sperm and also the fluid from the seminal vesicles. Now the prostate, what isn't drawn here is the rectum, which means the rectum sits right next to the prostate, and that's why a digital examination of the prostate can occur because you can feel the prostate, you can feel its size, you can feel its hardness, and you can feel its texture. Is it lumpy or bumpy or whatever it may be? Because as males age, the prostate grows, and as it grows, the tissue and cells develop, and it can impede and squeeze on the urethra, which makes it very difficult to urinate. And so this is known as prostatic hyperplasia. Then from the prostate we have the urethra, and the urethra travels through the penis, and you can see the penis here. Now the penis is made up of spongiform tissue. At the very end of the penis we've got what's called the glans penis. Now it's made up of spongiform tissue, and what happens is this: when it's time for erection and ejaculation, so erection and ejaculation needs to occur in order to eject that sperm into the vagina of the female. When we look at erection, think of the word point. When you think of ejaculation, think of shoot. Point and shoot. Why? Because the P for erection is going to be parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for erection, and the S is sympathetic nervous system. That is responsible for ejaculation. The parasympathetic nervous system will tell the blood vessels to dilate. Blood enters the penis and it compresses the veins so blood can't leave. So the erection is blood filling the spongiform tissue of the penis. Then the ejaculation is coming from stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, telling the smooth muscle of this tube to contract, pushing the sperm and the semen through. And this is a quick run through or overview of the reproductive system of males. Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. In this video we're going to take a look at the female reproductive system. Now to begin with, I think we should look at the external anatomy or the external genitalia, also known as the vulva of the female reproductive system, and then we'll move through and have a look at the female reproductive tract. So when we look at the external anatomy, a couple of things. First of which you can see that we have what's called the mons pubis. Now the mons pubis is this fatty pad, mons pubis, is a fatty pad that overlays that of the pubic symphysis, so the very front of the pubis itself. We can see that there are two skin folds. In actual fact, there are two lots of two skin folds, which we call the labia, and the most external aspect is going to be called the labia majora. Labia majora, which are two skin folds that basically begin at the mons pubis and they finish down at the perineum. Now, the labia majora is homologous to that of the scrotum. So they are skin folds and they have muscle in them similar to that of the dartos muscles of the scrotum itself. Then there are more internal skin folds that we call the labia minora. Labia minora. And these skin folds move from the clitoris down to the vaginal orifice itself. Now what you'll find is that the mons pubis, the labia majora, labia minora, and then as we start to move in to what we call the vestibule. Now the vestibule is the recess that sits within the skin folds of the labia majora, okay, the vestibule. And what you'll find with the vestibule is it contains most superiorly that of the clitoris, and the clitoris is highly innervated with sensory neurons. So it is extremely sensitive and it plays a very important role when it comes to sexual arousal, when it comes to female reproduction. As we move down, you'll find that there's the external urethral orifice, external urethral orifice, which is obviously going to be where the urethra coming from the bladder moves through to move urine out of the body. And then we've got the vaginal orifice itself. Vaginal orifice. Now, the vaginal orifice, as we can see here, so here is the vagina. It plays an extremely important role in separating out the external environment from the internal environment of the female reproductive tract. Really important. And because of that, it actually has a pH that's quite acidic. And this is important to maintain the vagina when it comes to keeping it clean, because again, it's playing an important role separating the external from internal environment. But because it's acidic, any sperm that enters may be damaged or killed off, and therefore that's why sperm moves through in semen, which is slightly alkaline, to neutralize the acid of the vagina. Now, as we move from the vagina, we get to that of the cervix. Cervix. Now, cervix or cervical or cervical, you've probably heard of being referred to as the neck here. And that's what cervix means. Cervix means neck because the cervix is the neck of the uterus, which we have here. Now, the uterus is a muscular body and it comprises of a couple of important layers. The two that I want you to be aware of is the most internal layer of the uterus, which is a layer that thickens when a woman becomes pregnant, and this is called the endometrium. Endometrium. And then a thick muscular layer, which is called the myometrium. Now, the important role of the uterus and that of the endometrium is that when an egg becomes fertilized and then implants, it implants in the uterus and specifically implants in the endometrium. But the endometrium in a woman who's not pregnant is quite thin. So during the process of fertilization, the endometrium prepares itself. It becomes thickened and more vascularized because of the important roles of estrogen and progesterone. So it thickens, vascularizes, and that egg implants in the endometrium to nourish that fertilized egg. The myometrium, being this thick muscle, is important for when that embryo is developed into basically that embryo has developed into an unborn child, and it's time for that child to be pushed out. So this baby that's now developed, when it's time, full term, baby needs to be pushed out. Because of the role of oxytocin, it's going to contract the myometrium of the uterus and help push the baby out through the cervix, through the vagina. Now, as we can see, we've got the top of the uterus, which is called the fundus, and it starts to enter these two tubes, which are called the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes. So the fallopian tubes carry both sperm and egg, right? Now, there's a couple of different areas. The thinnest portion of the uterine tube is known as the isthmus, and that's this area here. And as it moves through, you've got this region here called the ampulla, and the ampulla, in actual fact, is the most common area for the sperm to fertilize the ovum or egg that's been pushed out by the ovary. So, when sperm enters the vagina, it then has to swim through the cervix, it has to swim through the uterus, has to go through the isthmus, has to go through most of the fallopian or uterine tubes, and it's at the ampulla in which it will fertilize the egg, which means the egg or oocyte will be ovulated here from the ovary and move through to the ampulla. Okay? So, the end of the fallopian tube is called the infundibulum. Infundibulum, nice name. Infundibulum, which has these little fingertip-like projections called fimbriae. When it's time for ovulation, so for that egg to leave the ovary to go into the uterine tubes, these fimbriae swell and they play an important role in help moving that egg into the fallopian tubes, which means that this structure here on both sides is that of the ovary, and it's the ovary that contains the egg and ovulates that egg approximately every 28 days or every month. Extremely important. Now, the ovary also plays important roles in hormone production. So it plays a really important role in producing progesterone and estrogen. Really important role. And both of these two hormones are important when it comes to producing, maintaining that of the thickened endometrial lining. So what we've worked through at the moment is the external anatomy of the female reproductive system, which is called the vulva, and the internal anatomy, also known as the reproductive tract. So today we're going to focus on the female reproductive system and have a look at the female reproductive cycle. So before we begin, we need to have a look at some of the important anatomical features of the reproductive system. So what I've drawn up here very quickly is first of all the vagina, which then moves up into the cervix and then up into the uterus. Now, the uterus has a number of different important anatomical structures, such as the body of the uterus, the fundus of the uterus, and also the uterine walls, which is made up of a number of different layers. One layer, which we're going to focus on today, is the internal layer called the endometrium. Now, you can see that the uterus feeds through into two tubes. These are called uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes. And I've exaggerated just one of these uterine tubes. So you can see as we follow it through, it starts to branch out like little fingertips. Now, these little fingertips are called fimbriae. And what's the importance of these fimbriae? These fimbriae hold the ovary, okay? So you know that you've got one ovary on either side. Now, the ovary holds oocytes. So what's an oocyte? An oocyte, O-O-C-Y-T. An oocyte is basically an egg. Now, which is also known as an ovum. Now, for females, you'll find that there are thousands of oocytes, what we call primordial oocytes, in one ovary. Where do they come from and how long have they had them? Well, basically, females, when they are in utero themselves, so for example, when a female is within their mummy's tummy, so to speak, they already have all the oocytes they need for their entire life. Their ovaries, even when they are in utero, their ovaries already contain all the oocytes they need, okay? Thousands of them. So, if I were to take this ovary and just draw up a couple of oocytes to begin with, there's going to be thousands and thousands of them. And we know that every single month the reproductive cycle begins and these oocytes start to prepare themselves for fertilization and the uterus starts to prepare itself for fertilization. So what we're going to talk about today is how does the body do this? So we know that many hormones are involved, this interplay of systems is involved, and we need to look at exactly what happens with stimulating those hormones and what happens as a response to releasing those hormones. So I've drawn up a little graph here, or at least the start of a graph, where we're going to have a look at hormone levels over the reproductive cycle. So how long does a reproductive cycle go for? Well, on average it's 28 days, but it can be as short as 21 days or as long as 35 days. But the average is 28 days. So I've drawn 1 to 28 days here, and this is going to represent hormonal levels of the reproductive cycle. Okay, so what are we beginning with? Well, day 1 of the reproductive cycle. The ovary has a number of oocytes, and we call them primordial follicles. So these oocytes are called primordial follicles. And at day 1, these primordial follicles, between 10 to 20 of them, okay, but I'm just going to draw 1 for reference, between 10 to 20 of them start to develop. Now, what does a primordial follicle develop into? It develops into something called a primary follicle. Now, a primary follicle, again, has the oocyte, or the ovum, and this oocyte is surrounded by some cells. Some flat-looking cells which are called follicle cells or follicular cells. And again, the whole structure is called a primary follicle. Now, these follicular cells, what's the point of them being around the oocyte? Well, they basically provide nourishment for the oocyte. They keep it alive. Now, this primary follicle, or at least between 10 to 20 of these primary follicles that have just been made, starting at day 1, they will not turn into the next form, which is called a secondary follicle, unless there is a stimulus to tell it to do so. Now, the stimulus is going to be a hormone. So we need to talk about the first hormone that's released within this process. Now, what we need to talk about quickly is where's this hormone released from and what's its stimulus. So, if we were to draw up very quickly, central nervous system, we've got the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and we've got the midbrain, pons and medulla, and then the brainstem. There's a very important part which we've spoken about before, and this important part is called the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is located around about here, and you know that just below the hypothalamus is a projection called the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. So this is what we need to focus on to begin with. So I'll just get rid of this and I'll draw them up in more detail. So I've got the hypothalamus, I've got the anterior pituitary gland and posterior. So I'll just write them up for reference. Hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and this one's the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so what's happening? Well, the primordial follicles are now turned into primary follicles with these follicular cells providing nourishment to the oocyte. Now they want to go to the next form, which are called secondary follicles, but they can't unless a particular hormone is released. Now, the hypothalamus has a number of different hormones that it releases. One is called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. So let's write that down. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. What this means is this hormone releases gonadotropins because it's a gonadotropin releasing hormone. What are gonadotropins? Well, gonado refers to sex cells, so this is going to be either the ovaries for women or the sperm cells for males, or testes I should say, the ovaries for women or the testes for males. So that's gonado. Tropin means it's a hormone that stimulates the release of another hormone. Okay, so gonadotropin means it's a hormone that goes to the gonads to tell it to release another hormone. And this gonadotropin releasing hormone, without trying to confuse it, releases gonadotropin. So the hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, and this travels down to the anterior pituitary gland to tell it to release gonadotropins, because that's a gonadotropin releasing hormone. So here in the anterior pituitary gland, we have gonadotropins which are released. Now, these gonadotropins, there's two. One is called follicle stimulating hormone, and one is called luteinizing hormone. So let's write that up very quickly. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH is luteinizing hormone. So, which one of these two do you think is going to stimulate this follicle from going from primary to secondary? Well, it's going to be the follicle stimulating hormone. So, the primary follicle will not turn into a secondary follicle until FSH is released from the anterior pituitary gland. And FSH, like I said, is going to travel to the ovum, or to the ovary, and stimulate primary movement to secondary follicle. Now, a secondary follicle cell, again, has these follicular cells, but these follicular cells have now turned into something else. This something else is called granular cells. So the ovum, or oocyte, the granular cells, which are now surrounded by another group of cells called theca cells. And very importantly, surrounding the oocyte is a layer called the zona pellucida. So I'm just going to write that down here. Zona pellucida. What's the importance of this zona pellucida layer surrounding the oocyte? Well, when this oocyte has been released from the ovary into the uterine tube, this zona pellucida allows for, because remember, there's going to be, hopefully, a number of sperm coming in to try and fertilize that oocyte. And what the zona pellucida does is, as soon as one sperm gets in to the zona pellucida, it shuts all the doors and doesn't allow any more sperm in. So if I were to draw that up very quickly, if after all this has happened, so I'm jumping forward a little bit, we've got the oocyte surrounded by the zona pellucida, and you've got all these sperm cells coming in. Once one sperm cell has penetrated through the zona pellucida, no other sperm cell can get into the egg to fertilize it. Okay? Very important. That's the function of the zona pellucida. Now, once the follicle stimulating hormone released from the anterior pituitary gland has told the primary follicle to turn into the secondary follicle, I said that there's the oocyte in the secondary follicle, there's the zona pellucida, important for letting sperm in, there's granular cells and theca cells. Now together, the granular cells and theca cells produce something very important, and this important something is estrogen. The hormone estrogen. And what does estrogen do? Well, estrogen will travel to the uterus and will tell the uterus to start to prepare its uterine lining. Why is it doing this? Because it's saying, hey, there's a baby coming, fingers crossed. We need to prepare the uterine lining for implantation. So that's what this estrogen does. So, estrogen will travel and prepare that uterine lining for implantation. Now, let's go to this graph which we haven't drawn up yet. What two hormones have I spoken about predominantly? I spoke about FSH being released and I spoke about estrogen being released. So if we were to first focus on FSH, so let's put FSH in blue. What you'll find is from day one, FSH starts to increase. Okay? Why? Well, because once this primary follicle cell wants to turn into secondary, we need FSH to be released, and it's happening a couple of days after day one, starting from day one and moving forward. Once this has happened and we produce secondary cells, estrogen's being released, which means that, so let's write estrogen in green. Estrogen starts to release and starts to go up. Now, this secondary cell turns into something called a mature follicle. So, primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, mature follicle, also known as a Graafian follicle. And what happens with this follicle is that, again, has the oocyte, has the zona pellucida, remember important for letting sperm in, has granular cells, and these granular cells start to really grow, really get thick. And then has the theca cells as well on the outside. And what you see happens is that it starts to protrude against the wall of the ovary. Okay? And this is a mature follicle. Now, this mature follicle, because it's producing so many, remember, theca and granular cells, it again starts to release more estrogen. So estrogen levels start to go up and up and up. So that means estrogen goes up and up and up and up and up. Now the important point is, as estrogen goes up, it feeds back to the hypothalamus and stops what? Follicle stimulating hormone from being released. So negative feedback. So this follicle stimulating hormone starts to drop down again. However, once these mature follicles start to produce more and more and more and more estrogen, what happens is the estrogen levels get so high that it hits a point in which, for some reason we don't know why, instead of negatively feeding back, it positively feeds back. And so what do you think happens? Well, we get a surge in the production of both follicle stimulating hormone and especially luteinizing hormone. So high levels of estrogen have now told follicle stimulating hormone to peak and have now told luteinizing hormone to surge. And before that, luteinizing hormone was quite low. But now what's happened is luteinizing hormone is bumped up like that. Really important. So just before day 14, luteinizing hormone has bumped up. Now what does luteinizing hormone do? Luteinizing hormone travels to this mature follicle and it starts to weaken the wall of the ovary. That's the first thing. Luteinizing hormone starts to weaken the wall of the ovary here where that mature follicle has started to protrude out. And what does this do? Well, this results in the oocyte, or the egg, from being released. Oops. Now once that egg is being pushed out and released, it's surrounded, like I said, by that zona pellucida. And what's remaining? Well, the granular and theca cells. So what you end up having is a remnant group of cells that look like that. Now, this remnant group of cells, because remember, we've got the oocyte has just been ejected, So now we've got the oocyte with the zona pellucida, and now we've got these granular cells with theca cells here. Okay, now the continual release of luteinizing hormone at this point here continues to stimulate this little remnant group of cells. What's it tell these groups of cells to do? It tells them to release another hormone. And this hormone that it's telling it to release is called progesterone. What does progesterone do? Progesterone travels again to the uterus, and it tells the uterus to really start to prepare its lining for implantation. Because think about it, that egg's now been released. It's going, okay, baby's coming. Really starts to prepare for implantation. So it thickens up that endometrium, and this is also what progesterone does, is it makes it highly vascularized. We've now got a huge amount of blood vessels in this endometrial wall. Really important. Now, think about what's going to happen. This thing here, which is now called the corpus luteum, think about it, luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing means it turns it into something called the corpus luteum. So the luteum body means yellow body, because this yellow stuff is fat and cholesterol and produces progesterone. And as this progesterone is released, it further thickens up the endometrium, makes it highly vascularized and saying, okay, baby's coming, baby's coming. It will continue to do this for about 10 days. So think about it. At day 14, what happened? Luteinizing hormone was released to tell the ovum to come out. That's ovulation. So day 14 was ovulation. And we've got follicle stimulating hormone has dropped off. Luteinizing hormone is continually telling this system to release progesterone, progesterone, progesterone. The estrogen levels have gone up and then start to drop back down again. But for 10 days, progesterone is continually being released by the corpus luteum to continually prepare this endometrial lining, which means that if I were to now draw progesterone up, it starts off low and then jumps up high and then jumps back down again. Now, for 10 days, because think about it, if no sperm comes to fertilize the egg, what happens at the end of the 28 days? Menstruation occurs. So let's talk about that very quickly. No sperm has come in. Do you think this corpus luteum has any idea that no sperm has come in? It has no idea. So what it's thought, what's going on is that it goes, okay, I've released the ovum, and that ovum is going to get fertilized by sperm and then implants itself into the endometrial wall. That's what it thinks. And so it goes, okay, I'll keep preparing the endometrial wall for 10 days. And then what should happen is if that ovum does get fertilized and implants, once that fertilized egg is implanted in the wall, a signal should get sent. If it doesn't happen, no signal gets sent. Now, after 10 days, this corpus luteum, if no fertilization has happened, it goes, oh, I'm not hearing anything. What's going on? So it starts to degenerate and starts to die. And what happens to progesterone levels? It starts to drop off. As progesterone levels start to drop off, this endometrial lining, which is now thickened and highly vascularized, also starts to die off. And it begins to slough off. That means it starts to fall away from the wall. And this highly vascularized tissue starts to bleed out. At day 28, and this is called menstruation. So if no fertilization occurs, what happens? Well, what happens is no signal is sent, progesterone drops off, and menstruation occurs. So just as a very quick recap, what's happened? Well, every female starts off with thousands of primordial oocytes, primordial follicles. At day 1 of their cycle, reproductive cycle, these primordial follicles, between 10 to 20 of them, turn into primary follicles. These primary follicles, under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone, turn from primary follicles into secondary follicles. These secondary follicles have granular cells and theca cells, which release estrogen. This estrogen prepares the endometrial lining for implantation of a fertilized egg. In addition to that, it also sends a negative feedback signal to the hypothalamus saying stop releasing FSH and LH. But as this secondary follicle turns into mature follicles, it produces so much estrogen that for some reason that negative feedback reverses and becomes positive feedback. And you get this huge influx of both FSH and LH. Specifically, this LH results in this surge of luteinizing hormone that's being released. This luteinizing hormone is important because it tells the egg to ovulate. So that's what luteinizing hormone does, tells the egg to ovulate, and also tells the corpus luteum to release progesterone. This progesterone will continue to be released for about 10 days and will further prepare the endometrial lining for implantation. If that egg does not get fertilized and does not implant itself, progesterone levels start to drop off. This happens at around about day 28. Once this progesterone levels start to drop off, the endometrial lining starts to die and slough off, and this is called menstruation. In the next video, I'll talk about what happens if that egg does get fertilized. So in this video, we're going to talk very briefly about the testes and sperm production. So before we begin, just remember that there are 2 testes, and they are around about 4 centimeters in length, 2.5 centimeters in width, and weigh around about 10 to 12 grams each. The purpose of the testes is twofold. Predominantly, they are there for sperm production, and they are also there for androgen production. Now, androgens are male sex hormones, for example, testosterone. So, what we're going to look at here, first of all, is I've drawn, to the best of my ability, a testes, and you can see that, well, at least I've tried to cut out a wedge from the testes to see what's happening internally in regards to internal anatomy and also some of the physiological processes that occur within the testes. So, to begin with, let's talk about some anatomy. What you can see up here, above, so superior to the testes, is what we call the spermatic cord. And the spermatic cord moves from the testes up into the abdomen. So, this whole region here is the spermatic cord. And within the spermatic cord are a number of different anatomical structures. For example, there's the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens is sometimes called the vas deferens, and that is a tube that carries sperm that's produced in the testes and carries it up to the rest of the ductal system for the male reproductive tract. So that's the ductus deferens, is a tube carrying the sperm. Okay. What else is within this spermatic cord? Is the testicular artery. And the testicular artery is obviously going to be a branch of the abdominal aorta coming down and going to provide nutrients to the testes. So if there's going to be an artery, that also means there's going to be a venous system, so a vein. Now the veins that come back up and out of the testes are actually a plexus. So they're like a braiding that comes out. Now, it's not called the testicular artery per se, but it's called the pampiniform plexus. So remember I said plexus is like a braiding. Remember you've got the various spinal plexuses of the spinal nerve plexuses, and remember it's sort of going to come out like this, and then it's going to look a little bit like that, and then come back. So this pampiniform plexus, so remember you're going to have the aorta, the branch of the abdominal aorta, which is the testicular artery coming down, providing warm, nutrient-rich blood to the testes. And then you've got this pampiniform plexus coming up right next door to it. Now the reason why we have this pampiniform plexus is because this venous supply cools the arterial blood coming down. Why do we want to cool this blood? Well, testes, when it comes to sperm production, the ideal temperature for sperm production is around about 2 to 3 degrees lower than internal body temperature, which means the ideal temperature has to be 2 to 3 degrees lower than the blood that's coming in to feed it. So this blood's going to be too warm for the testes. And so this venous supply cools it down. That's another reason why the testes are found exterior to the body. Okay? All right. What else can we find? Well, we can find the testicular nerve. And we can also find the cremaster muscle. Now the cremaster muscle is a muscle that comes down through the spermatic cord, and what does it do? Well, when it's relaxed, the testes drop. When it contracts, the testes lift up. Again, this has to do with temperature regulation. So when the body is hot, or when the temperature is hot, again, testes need to be 2 to 3 degrees cooler than the internal body temperature. So the cremaster muscle relaxes and the testes drop. If it's cold, well, the testes need to be warmer. Contracts, lifts the testes up. Now, this is the spermatic cord. You've got a couple of different layers surrounding the testes, which we won't really go through, but it's important that you know that there is a muscular layer surrounding the testes, and that muscle is called the dartos muscle. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is the dartos muscle plays another important role in temperature regulation of the testes. So when it is cold, the dartos muscles contract and wrinkles up the scrotum. When it is warm, the dartos muscles relax and the scrotum becomes less wrinkly, and again has to do with temperature regulation. When it's cold and wrinkles up, well, that means that it holds on to the temperature, and vice versa when the temperature increases. So what are the two muscles involved in temperature regulation for the testes? The cremaster muscles, which raise and lower the testes, and the dartos muscles, which change the scrotum in regards to wrinkly or less wrinkly. Okay, now let's talk about sperm production. Now, what you can find here is, I told you that you've got that ductus deferens, which is in the spermatic cord, and that ductus deferens is attached here. And what we're going to find is that this ductus deferens is attached to the epididymis. Now the epididymis, which you can find this part that I'm colouring in here, is where sperm is stored and further matures. Okay? The epididymis, which I'm colouring in here, is where sperm is stored and also further matures. Now, there are some ducts or branches of this that go into the testes, and these branches further branch off into individual lobes of the testes. So you can see I've drawn individual lobes here. There's actually around about 200 to 250 lobes within the testes, and these lobes turn into smaller tubules, and this is where sperm is produced. These tubules are called seminiferous tubules. Now again, let's label a couple of things. First of all, we've got the epididymis, where sperm is stored and matures. And here we've got seminiferous tubules, and this is where sperm is produced. And therefore, sperm being produced in the seminiferous tubules travels through these ducts into the epididymis and then up into the ductus deferens. Now, what I want to do for the rest of this video is focus on what's happening right here in regards to sperm production. So if I were to take one of these seminiferous tubules and have a look, that's going to be inside of that tubule. Actually, I'll draw it a little bit smaller. So that's inside the seminiferous tubule, and this is the wall of the seminiferous tubule. And then you're going to have all the area outside of the seminiferous tubule. Now, what you're going to find is that there's a number of different cell types that you need to be aware of. First of all, you've got cells present around here in the walls of the seminiferous tubules. These cells are called sustentacular cells. Isn't that a good name? Sustentacular. Sustentacular cells, which we also call Sertoli cells. Sertoli. Okay, what's the importance of Sertoli cells? They produce a very important hormone called ABP, and we'll talk about that in a sec. ABP, androgen binding protein. In addition to that, there are cells that sit outside of the seminiferous tubule walls, so in the interstitium, and therefore these cells are called interstitial cells. So these cells are called interstitial cells. But again, they have another name, and they're called Leydig cells. And what do Leydig cells do? Well, Leydig cells produce testosterone. Okay, what else do we have? We have stem cells in the walls of these seminiferous tubules. Sperm stem cells. So these can obviously turn into sperm. So how does this process occur? Okay, well, once a male has reached puberty, remember, if we look at the brain, you know, cerebellum, cerebrum, cerebellum, midbrain, pons, medulla, so forth, and that right here, you've got your hypothalamus, and you've got two danglies here, which aren't the testes, but is the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. Remember that the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland is very important when it comes to sperm production. So if we were to draw the hypothalamus up here, here's the hypothalamus. Let's say that this one on this side is the anterior pituitary gland. Well, remember, similar to when we spoke about the female reproductive cycle, you have gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is released by the hypothalamus, travels down through the blood supply to the anterior pituitary gland, and tells the anterior pituitary gland to release two hormones called gonadotropins. Remember, these hormones are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, what happens here is that these two hormones, when a male reaches puberty, is that they travel to the seminiferous tubules. And if we have a quick look, what you'll find is that the follicle stimulating hormone travels to the Sertoli cells and stimulates Sertoli cells. Luteinizing hormone travels to the Leydig cells and stimulates the Leydig cells. Which means what happens when a male hits puberty is that the sustentacular cells, or the Sertoli cells, produce ABP. So now ABP is released in here. Into the walls of the seminiferous tubules. And luteinizing hormone stimulates the Leydig cells outside here in the interstitium to produce testosterone. And this testosterone moves in as well. Together, these two hormones stimulate these stem cells. The name of these stem cells is spermatogonia. Okay? Spermatogonia or spermatogonium. And together, ABP and testosterone stimulate these cells to start producing sperm. And so this sperm is, and what happens is as this sperm is produced, it starts to move towards the lumen or the hollow inside of the tube. So the hollow inside of that tube. And as this sperm is being produced and starts to mature a little bit more, it then gets into the tubule. And what do we find? We now have sperm within our seminiferous tubules. And what did I say happened to those sperm? They travel into the epididymis, where they are further matured and they are stored, and then when it's time for ejaculation, they'll move up to the ductus deferens. So, just to summarise, this particular part here. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulated Sertoli cells, and the Sertoli cells released ABP. Luteinizing hormone stimulated the Leydig cells, and they released testosterone. Together, these stimulated spermatogenesis, which is sperm production. So if you have any questions, pop me an email. I hope that made sense. Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. In this video I want to discuss the really important role that the gonadotropins, a set of hormones produced by the brain, what role they play in both the male and female reproductive systems. So to begin with, we know that there is a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and there is a projection of the hypothalamus called the pituitary gland, and it has an anterior and posterior lobe. We're going to focus on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland because that is where the gonadotropins are produced. So the gonadotropins, firstly, gonad is referring to the male and female reproductive organs. So for the males, testes, females, ovaries. Tropins tells you that this hormone, or these hormones, are going to travel to these tissues, the gonads, and tell them to release more hormones. All right? Now what are the gonadotropins? The gonadotropins are follicle stimulating hormone. So it's follicle stimulating hormone, also known as FSH and luteinizing hormone. Also known as LH. Now, these two gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, they're named after what they do in the female reproductive system. So let's focus on that one first. So what do they do? All right. Firstly, let's look at follicle stimulating hormone, and we know they play their role at the ovary. So let's draw an ovary up here. And what we need to know is that every month through the menstrual cycle or the reproductive cycle, what's happening is that there are these primordial follicles. So there's a whole number of eggs and they need to begin to mature. Now what you're going to find is that around about 14 days of this cycle, an egg will be ovulated. This egg will be taken up into the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes and will be waiting for fertilization, for a sperm to come along. Now in order for this process to happen, you're going to have a number of primordial oocytes that will turn into something called a primary follicle. So this is a primary follicle right here. Now the primary follicle will be frozen. It's stuck there until follicle stimulating hormone comes along. That's unsurprising, right? It's named after what it does. It stimulates the follicle. So follicle stimulating hormone comes along and stimulates the primary follicle to turn into something called a secondary follicle. And this secondary follicle will start to grow and develop a number of different cells around it. Now these cells are going to produce a hormone called estrogen. Really important, estrogen. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this secondary follicle is going to begin to turn into a more mature or Graafian follicle. And this more mature follicle is going to really start to thicken up these cells. Now these cells are called granular cells or theca cells. They're going to start to thicken up, really pump out that estrogen. But now we're at around about day 14 and something needs to happen. That egg inside needs to be ovulated. This is where luteinizing hormone comes along. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation. This egg then gets ovulated and it's going to ovulate into the fallopian tubes, right? Now the thing is this, once luteinizing hormone has told that egg to ovulate, these cells remain. Now, we said that follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicles. What does luteinizing hormone do? So lutein means yellow. Luteinizing means to make something yellow. What happens is these cells that are now remaining, so there's a little group of cells that are now remaining, they start to become yellow and they are called the corpus luteum. Corpus meaning body, luteum meaning yellow. Now I haven't drawn it up as yellow, but it is. And what these cells do is they start to produce progesterone. So what have we found? We've found that follicle stimulating hormone stimulates a primary follicle to go to a secondary follicle and that produces estrogen. Luteinizing hormone tells the egg to ovulate and the remaining cells, called the corpus luteum, produce progesterone. What does both estrogen and progesterone do? They prepare the uterine lining for implantation. So uterus preparation. Endometrial thickening starts to become more vascular, starts to thicken, and this is going to obviously be beneficial for egg implantation or some fertilized blastocyst implantation. Let's now focus on what's happening in the, so again, let's just label this because this is the ovary, this is going to be female. Let's now have a look at what's happening in the male reproductive system. So we're going to have a testy, not an ovary, we're going to have a testy. And in the testy, we're going to have something called seminiferous tubules. This is where sperm is produced and that's going to give you an indication as to what these two particular hormones are going to do. So what we're going to find is in the testy, we're going to look inside the testes, we're going to have a look inside the seminiferous tubules and it's going to be a hollow tube like this. What you're going to find is there's a couple of different types of cells. All right? First type of cell is going to be a group of cells that sit inside this tube like this. These cells are called sustentacular cells, also known as Sertoli cells. Really important. Then there's going to be a group of cells that sit outside the tubules. They're called interstitial cells. Interstitial cells, also known as Leydig cells. All right, what happens? Follicle stimulating hormone gets released. What does follicle stimulating hormone do? Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the Sertoli cells. All right. What does it stimulate the Sertoli cells to do? Stimulates them to produce something. What does it stimulate them to produce? Something called ABP. ABP is androgen binding protein. Androgen binding protein. All right. What does luteinizing hormone do? I'll tell you what it does in a sec. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the Leydig cells. So think of the L in luteinizing stimulating the Leydig cells. And what do they produce? They produce testosterone. Testosterone. All right, here's the thing. Androgen. And androgen is a male sex hormone. Testosterone is the male sex hormone. Androgen binding protein. So it must bind to testosterone, and that's exactly what it does. ABP and testosterone bind together. And what do they do together? They start to produce sperm. So what do we have? We've got estrogen and progesterone preparing the endometrium or the uterus for implantation, and ABP and testosterone producing sperm. So luteinizing hormone stimulates Leydig cells to produce testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates Sertoli cells to produce ABP. There's going to be a quick and easy way to present this now. Let's have a look. What we can now do is take this information that we've learnt. We can say, all right, here's male reproductive system, here's female reproductive system. Follicle stimulating hormone for the male reproductive system, follicle stimulating hormone for the female reproductive system. What did it do? Let's start with female. Stimulated primary to secondary follicle. Then what did that secondary follicle do? It produced estrogen. What about in the male reproductive system? Follicle stimulating hormone stimulated, what cell type was it? It was was it interstitial? Was it Sertoli? It was Sertoli. Stimulated the Sertoli cells, and these Sertoli cells produced, do you remember what it was? Androgen binding protein, ABP. Luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone stimulated ovulation in the female reproductive system, and that corpus luteum that was remaining, what did that, so led to a corpus luteum. What did that corpus luteum do? It produced progesterone. What about in the male reproductive system? Luteinizing hormone, Leydig cells. What did the Leydig cells do? Testosterone. Testosterone. And together, what did these two do? Sperm production. And what did these two do in the female reproductive system? Prepare the uterus. So there we go. This is the role that the gonadotropins, FSH and LH, play in the male and female reproductive systems.